The house was silent when I returned from the funeral, the kind of silence that doesn't comfort you. It presses down, reminding you of all that's lost. The air felt heavier than the summer heat, thick with grief and the faint smell of lilies from the chapel. My hands were trembling, not from exhaustion, but from the strange realization that my life had changed forever in ways I couldn't yet grasp. Ellen had always been meticulous, even in death. I had watched her coffin lowered, and her favorite roses laid upon it, and still, I could feel a weight pressing against my chest. Not just the sorrow, but something else, something I had not anticipated. I wandered through our living room, the walls echoing with the absence of her voice. Her favorite painting hung slightly crooked, as though the world itself had tilted in her passing. I sank into the sofa, the leather cold and unfamiliar without her sitting beside me. The children's laughter, now only an echo of memory, haunted me. I thought about my son, Matthew, waiting at home, his face pale, eyes wide with grief he hadn't yet learned to process. He had always been closer to his mother, her shadow following him like a soft echo of comfort. And now, without her, he looked smaller, fragile, a boy forced too soon into a world heavy with adult sorrow. I thought about Ellen's smile, the one that had lit up the kitchen on quiet mornings, coffee in hand, humming a tune that only she seemed to hear. And I thought about the second house she had quietly acquired, a secret she had never shared with either of us. It wasn't just a property, it was a plan, a corner of the world that she had intended to keep for herself, a private sanctuary she had never intended to reveal. My mind raced. I had discovered it by accident, in the files she had meticulously organized, bills, deeds, receipts, all carefully labeled. The address was unfamiliar, the paperwork clean, official, a second home meant to remain undiscovered. Matthew would have expected honesty, I knew that. Yet, a peculiar sense of protection stirred inside me. Would it hurt him to know? Could he understand the complexity of grief, of loss, of a wife who had left both tangible and emotional legacies? I folded the documents carefully, placing them back in the drawer where no curious hands would find them for a long while. This was mine to guard, at least for now. My grief became intertwined with a quiet strategy, a secret that somehow made me feel alive in the midst of death. The days following the funeral blurred together. Friends visited, murmuring condolences, bringing food and flowers, their voices polite but hollow. Conversations repeated themselves, each one a reminder of the void Ellen had left behind. I would nod, smile faintly, and excuse myself to the solitude of my thoughts, where the secret of the second house rested like a seed waiting for the right moment to grow. Matthew asked questions, few, careful, sometimes almost hesitant, as though he feared that his curiosity might fracture the fragile remnants of our shared world. I answered him, carefully, choosing each word as if it were a step across a narrow ledge over a dark chasm. One afternoon, as I wandered through Ellen's garden, I noticed the roses had wilted slightly, neglected in our absence. I knelt down, touching the soft petals, inhaling their subtle fragrance, and for the first time, allowed a smile to surface, tinged with bitterness and a strange sense of cunning. The second house had become a silent partner in my grief, a private place where I could breathe without the immediate expectations of the world, a secret that made me feel a little less powerless. In its quiet isolation, I imagined planning a life that could incorporate this inheritance without disrupting Matthew's fragile sense of security. The thought of Matthew discovering the second house unnerved me. I pictured his face, the mix of confusion and hurt, the potential for envy or resentment. He had loved his mother fiercely, unquestioningly, and this knowledge could twist that love into something bitter, even unintentionally. I resolved, firmly, that he would not know, not yet. Perhaps never. This was my decision, my burden, and in a strange, paradoxical way, it felt like the only control left in a life suddenly devoid of it. Night fell, and the house grew darker than usual, the shadows stretching long across the polished floors. I found myself in Ellen's study, her chair still turned slightly toward the window, the faint scent of her perfume lingering like a ghost. I placed the documents on her desk, staring at them as if they might whisper instructions to me, guidance on what to do next. And then I laughed softly, a sound strange to my own ears, born of grief but tinged with relief. Relief that I could protect the secret, relief that I could maintain some semblance of power in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable. The next morning, Matthew asked about the funeral arrangements, about the division of belongings, about the things Ellen had left behind. I answered patiently, carefully, without revealing the hidden house. Each word was measured, each pause intentional. I watched him process, watched his expression shift subtly as he wrestled with grief and expectation. I could see the weight pressing down on him, and I felt an odd mix of sorrow and satisfaction. This secret, this second house, was mine to control, mine to guard, a private testament to both Ellen's foresight and my own discretion. I began visiting the second house, pretending it was just an errand, a mundane task. The property was modest, not ostentatious, not the type to provoke jealousy or desire. But it was well kept, warm, filled with memories waiting to be made, a sanctuary untouched by the complications that had filled our first home. Each visit reminded me of the contrast between what was public and private, between what Matthew knew and what he could never imagine. It became a ritual, one that allowed me to step into a space where grief and strategy merged seamlessly. There were moments when I questioned myself, of course. Was I being selfish? Was it fair to keep Matthew in the dark? But each time, I reminded myself that grief was a fragile thing, that timing mattered, and that some truths, when revealed too soon, could fracture hearts unnecessarily. Ellen had understood this in ways I could now appreciate, leaving behind the second house as both a gift and a lesson, a puzzle meant to test discretion, patience, and wisdom. I found myself planning small improvements, organizing spaces, touching walls, imagining furniture placement, and quietly feeling the weight of legacy in my hands. It was work that soothed me, work that reminded me that life, even in the shadow of loss, was still mine to shape. Matthew remained unaware, and perhaps that was best. I could see him occasionally, visiting the first house, navigating grief with care and innocence, unaware that a parallel world existed, a hidden space of safety, reflection, and quiet autonomy that belonged only to me. Weeks passed, each day stretching longer than the last, yet the second house remained a sanctuary I alone could enter. I walked through its quiet hallways, the faint echo of my footsteps a gentle reminder that here, I was the master of my own world. The furniture was simple, tasteful, and deliberately chosen. Ellen had always had an eye for harmony without ostentation. Each room held a story, a memory she had quietly embedded in the walls, in the patterns of the tiles, in the placement of door frames and windows. It was her gift to me, a subtle way of reminding me that even in her absence, there was structure, beauty, and a space untouched by grief or expectation. Matthew continued to struggle with the absence of his mother. I watched him navigate our first home with a careful tread, touching items she had left behind as though seeking connection, seeking reassurance that some part of her still lingered. I stayed patient, always present but never revealing the second house. His questions were few, tentative, filtered through grief and innocence. He didn't know of the property Ellen had secured silently, her foresight hidden beneath the layers of ordinary life. And perhaps, I thought, it was better this way. Grief, when shared prematurely, can fracture, and Matthew's heart was still tender, still raw. At the second house, I began making small adjustments, not for comfort or luxury, but to create a sense of permanence. A shelf in the study, aligned perfectly to the light streaming in from the west-facing window, the old rug straightened, its fibers brushed to remove the dust of abandonment. Each gesture was deliberate, a quiet ritual that allowed me to feel grounded, that reminded me that even in death, there was continuity, there was control. Ellen had left me not just a building, but a blueprint for resilience. I realized that the true gift was not the house itself, but the ability to navigate loss with autonomy, to make choices without interference, to live life on my own terms. Occasionally, I would imagine telling Matthew. I pictured the moment, his wide eyes, the shock of realizing that this new, quiet home existed while he had believed he had inherited the world alone. I imagined the questions he would ask, the confusion, the potential for resentment. But each time, I quickly closed that scenario, telling myself that timing mattered, and that the lessons embedded in grief and discovery should be approached with patience. Matthew needed to grow into understanding, and perhaps he would, one day. Until then, the secret was mine, a quiet anchor in the storm of our shared lives. One evening, I decided to spend more time in the study, sitting in Ellen's old chair, sipping tea as I reviewed her letters, her notes, the careful documentation she had left behind. There were letters to friends, drafts of her memoirs, small sketches, and personal reflections. Her handwriting, flowing and deliberate, reminded me of her intellect, her humor, her foresight. I could almost hear her voice as I traced the words with my eyes, imagining the laughter that had once filled our home, the quiet admonishments, the gentle encouragements. The second house, filled with her remnants, became more than just a property. It was a living reminder of her presence, a connection to her essence that death could not erase. As autumn approached, the leaves outside began to turn, and the light shifted in ways that reminded me of the passage of time. I planted bulbs in the garden Ellen had designed. Her meticulous patterns followed without deviation. Each step, each plant, was a meditation, a bridge between memory and future. The second house became a repository for hope, a place where grief could coexist with anticipation. I was learning to live again, not in the shadow of loss, but in the quiet growth of routine and purpose. Matthew's life continued in parallel. He celebrated milestones quietly, often without my immediate presence. I sent him cards, small notes of love and encouragement, never mentioning the house. I wanted him to navigate his grief independently, to build resilience without the weight of knowing all the secrets prematurely. The second house, untouched by his knowledge, became my safe harbor. I realized that keeping it secret was not deceit, it was protection, both for him and for myself. The autonomy it offered became a lesson in quiet strength, in measured action, and in understanding the nuances of love, loss, and discretion. One chilly evening, I took a long walk from the second house to the nearby park, the orange and gold leaves crunching beneath my feet. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from distant chimneys, a comforting scent that reminded me of home. I thought about the years Ellen and I had spent building our lives, the sacrifices she had made, the quiet resilience that had always been her hallmark. The house, secret and serene, was not just a physical space. It was a testament to careful planning, to the foresight of someone who understood the fragility of life and the value of strategic patience. The first time Matthew visited the first house alone after the funeral, I observed him from a distance. He moved cautiously through the rooms, touching items Ellen had treasured, pausing to remember her scent in the fabrics, the echoes of her laughter in the corners. His grief was raw but genuine, a reminder of the love that had shaped him. And yet, he was unaware that another space existed, another inheritance hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right time to reveal itself. I felt a complex mix of pride and melancholy. Ellen had protected both of us, each in her own way, and it was up to me to honor that wisdom. I began organizing the second house in a way that mirrored Ellen's meticulous habits. Files were sorted by date, letters alphabetized, items cataloged. Each small act of order restored a sense of control, a feeling that the world was not entirely chaotic. I found comfort in this, knowing that the house was a sanctuary not just of memory, but of actionable security. The property itself became a tool for reflection, a place where I could consider decisions carefully, where I could navigate grief without interference or urgency. As the months rolled by, I realized that the second house had become a mirror for my emotional state. Its quiet, methodical environment forced me to confront my feelings, to assess my grief, my anger, my love, and my patience. The property was more than an asset. It was a mentor of sorts, teaching lessons in discretion, emotional intelligence, and the subtleties of timing. Matthew remained unaware, and that secrecy became an act of care rather than deceit. I spent evenings reading in the study, Ellen's old recliner supporting me, a warm throw over my legs. The scent of her perfume lingered faintly in the room, a reminder of life's fragility and the persistence of memory. I wrote letters to no one, reflections, thoughts, fragments of advice I would someday share with Matthew when the moment was right. The second house became a classroom, a chapel, a library, and a sanctuary all in one, a place where I could reconcile my grief and plan my future without the weight of immediate disclosure. Winter arrived quietly, the first frost glinting along the edges of the second house's windows, transforming the garden into a crystalline scene. I moved through the property with careful steps, boots crunching on frozen leaves, noticing how even in stillness, life persisted. The bulbs I had planted in autumn were tucked under the soil, waiting for spring, a reminder that patience and preparation always bear fruit in time. I paused near the study window, gazing at the faint reflection of my face in the glass. The man staring back wasn't the same one who had grieved openly in the first weeks after Ellen's funeral. He was steadier, measured, aware of both his power and his limits. He had learned to navigate grief quietly, to channel sorrow into careful planning, and to protect not just his own heart, but the fragile heart of his son. I still observed Matthew from afar, a habit I hadn't broken. He was growing into his new life, attending school, engaging with friends, and finding ways to fill the void left by his mother. I never intervened unnecessarily, never revealed the secret that the second house existed, never allowed him a glimpse of the sanctuary she had quietly ensured for us. I wanted him to grow into understanding, into resilience, unburdened by knowledge that might complicate his grief or sow unintended resentment. In this careful withholding, I found peace, a quiet confirmation that I was honoring both Ellen's intentions and my responsibilities as a father. The house itself felt more alive than ever in the quiet of winter. Each room seemed to breathe, carrying the echoes of Ellen's laughter, the faint impressions of her daily rituals, the subtle touch of her style in every corner. I organized, I cleaned, I adjusted, and each act reminded me of what she had left behind. Not just property, but lessons in careful stewardship, foresight, and emotional intelligence. I felt the weight of responsibility, but it was no longer oppressive. It was deliberate, empowering, a testament to the life we had built together and the life I was now navigating alone. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, I lit a small fire in the living room hearth. Its warmth spread slowly through the house, filling it with comfort, a subtle contrast to the sharp chill of the winter evening. I sat in the study with a cup of tea, Ellen's handwriting spread across my lap, reading notes she had made for herself and her friends. Her words, meticulous and reflective, guided me subtly, reminding me that even in death, her presence could inform my choices. I realized then that the second house was not merely a hiding place. It was a living extension of her foresight, a space where I could navigate my grief with clarity and control. I began using the property in practical ways. I handled bills, ensured maintenance, and even took small trips to shop for essentials, always returning to the sense of calm it provided. Each visit strengthened my confidence. Each small act of organization reinforced my autonomy. I had learned to manage loss without letting it consume me, and the second house became a crucible for this transformation. It allowed me to feel grounded while navigating a life that had shifted irrevocably. Matthew eventually approached me about the first house. He asked questions about the funeral, about belongings, about what Ellen had wanted him to know. I answered carefully, deliberately, without revealing the second property. His questions were innocent, tender, filtered through grief, and I responded with honesty tempered by discretion. Each response was an exercise in balance, ensuring that I was guiding him through loss without burdening him with information he was not yet ready to process. The secrecy of the second house became an act of protection, a method of maintaining stability in his life while providing me a quiet sanctuary to rebuild myself. I spent hours planning for the future, considering ways to eventually introduce Matthew to the secret home without disrupting the fragile equilibrium of his world. I imagined his reaction: confusion, awe, and perhaps a mixture of gratitude and resentment. I understood that timing would be everything. I would wait until he had matured, until his grief had settled, and until he could comprehend the depth of Ellen's foresight without it overshadowing his own journey. Until then, I would maintain the quiet, careful control that had become my lifeline. In spring, when the frost finally receded, I walked the garden at the second house, noting tiny green shoots emerging through the soil. Life was returning, subtle but undeniable. The bulbs planted months before had survived the cold, a quiet triumph over the harshness of winter. I felt a similar triumph within myself. I had survived grief, maintained discretion, and reclaimed autonomy. The secret house had become both a refuge and a teacher, guiding me through loss while preserving the dignity of our shared past. One morning, Matthew asked to help with small chores in the first house, moving boxes, organizing items. I allowed him, observing silently, guiding without interference. I noticed the faint tension in his posture, the careful way he handled items, as though afraid to break something permanent. I realized that, in many ways, grief was still shaping him, molding him into a version of himself that would eventually be strong enough to handle truths that were not yet his to bear. The second house remained untouched in his mind, an unseen sanctuary, a symbol of patience, discretion, and careful timing. Occasionally, I would sit in the study, Ellen's notes spread before me, and reflect on the lessons embedded within her decisions. She had left more than property. She had left guidance, a roadmap for navigating life's most delicate moments. The second house represented this philosophy, a private, controlled space where grief, reflection, and planning could coexist. Each visit reinforced my sense of autonomy, teaching me to move carefully through loss, to balance emotion with strategy, and to protect those I loved from the inadvertent harms that could arise from knowledge too soon shared. As summer approached, the garden began to bloom in earnest. Tulips, daffodils, and the bulbs planted in autumn sprouted with vigor, creating a tapestry of color that celebrated resilience. I spent hours tending them, finding in the act a meditation, a bridge between past sorrow and future hope. The second house had become a sanctuary for both reflection and action, a place where I could rebuild not only the physical environment but also my emotional center. I felt alive again, not in the shadow of grief, but in the quiet cultivation of life and memory. Matthew began to ask more about Ellen's intentions, about what she would have wanted for us. I responded carefully, providing context without revealing the hidden property. I watched him grow, his understanding deepen, his grief evolve into strength. I knew that one day, he might learn about the second house, about the foresight Ellen had exercised. When that day came, I hoped it would be a lesson in patience, discretion, and resilience, a reflection of the values she had imparted silently, carefully, and lovingly. The second house became a symbol of balance, between grief and healing, secrecy and disclosure, loss and autonomy. I spent hours organizing, adjusting, tending, and reflecting, each act reinforcing my sense of control and quiet empowerment. I realized that life, even in the wake of loss, offered opportunities for strategy, patience, and thoughtful action. I had learned to navigate these spaces carefully, protecting both my son and myself while honoring the intentions of a woman whose foresight had always been quietly extraordinary. By the end of the summer, I had established a routine. Mornings spent in the garden, afternoons reviewing Ellen's notes, evenings reflecting quietly in the study. The second house had become a home for thought, for healing, for planning, and for the cultivation of patience. Matthew remained unaware, and that secrecy allowed both of us to navigate grief in our own ways, without interference or unintended harm. I understood now that some truths are best preserved until the mind and heart are ready to receive them, and I felt gratitude that Ellen had planned with such care, foresight, and love. The days continued to flow, each one marked by small acts of maintenance, quiet reflection, and careful observation. I had learned to live without constantly seeking validation, without depending on immediate recognition or gratitude. The second house represented stability, a place where grief could coexist with planning, reflection, and quiet hope. It was a space where I could navigate the aftermath of loss with clarity, discretion, and purpose. As autumn returned, I looked out the window at the garden's first hints of changing leaves. I thought about Matthew, about the lessons he would eventually learn, and about the careful patience required to preserve both his innocence and his eventual understanding. The second house remained secret, a space of control and sanctuary. I had learned that silence can be strength, that discretion can be love, and that grief, when managed thoughtfully, can coexist with hope, planning, and quiet empowerment.